Welcome to Native American history. Today we return to Minnesota in 1862, where a promise in the ledger turned into gunfire. Where are you watching from? Drop your location below. August 1862, Minnesota River Valley, the Eastern Dakota. Mediwakanton, Wapakute, Sisseton, Wapiton wait near the Lower Sioux Agency and Upper Sioux Agency for annuities promised by treaties signed in 1851 and narrowed again in 1858. Warehouses hold ledgers and IOUs. Crops falter. Federal money and goods are late. Traders press old debts. The Civil War draws regular troops east and leaves scattered posts to manage a rising emergency. United States officials at the agencies enforce ration rules and credit lines. Settler towns spread along the river bluffs and bottoms. At Fort Ridgely, volunteers and a few artillery pieces stand in for absent regulars. Couriers ride between farms and posts. Telegraph wires carry news only to larger towns. In council houses and along the riverbank, Dakota leaders weigh hunger against patience. Among them is Taoyatadute, known in English as Little Crow, a figure with influence but not a single army to command. This is the setting in which small delays become decisive. A fight near Acton ends in the deaths of 4 settlers. Rumor outruns proof. Families crowd the road to the forts. At the trader counter, a contemptuous phrase turns grievance into an open wound. Fact and folklore mingle in the telling, but the pressure is plain enough. People are hungry, promises are not kept. Authority is divided. The central question is simple and hard. What chain of obligations, decisions, and insults turned a month of scarcity into a war that would redraw life along the Minnesota River? A second question follows. Why did the choices made in the first 10 days at the agencies at Fort Ridgely, at New Ulm on the prairie roads, decide both the military outcome and the legal fate of hundreds? This story matters because it ties treaty language to empty shelves, council words to gunfire, and a river valley to an exile that would reach far beyond Minnesota. Spring to summer, 1862, formed the prelude. The Eastern Dakota had signed treaties at Traverse des Sioux and Mendota in 1851 that exchanged a vast homeland for cash and goods and a reservation along the Minnesota River. In 1858, another cession narrowed that land again. The promise was annual annuities in money, food, and supplies, delivered through the Lower Sioux Agency and Upper Sioux Agency. Delivery depended on appropriations in Washington and contractors on the river. Delays had happened before. In 1862, they stretched into hunger. Policy framed daily life. Indian affairs sat in the Interior Department, while forts and patrols belonged to the War Department. In practice, agency officials controlled rations, trader accounts, and discipline. Mission and agency schools pressed language change and work routines. Trader credit filled the gap when payments lagged. Then claims on annuities reduced what reached families when shipments came. By early summer, the stores at the agencies showed ledgers and IOUs more than flour and pork. Land pressure rose each year. Survey lines and homestead filings advanced from St. Paul and St. Peter up the valley. Rail projects and river landings drew timber and freight. Game grew scarce near the settlements. Farming on narrowed acreage left little cushion when crops failed. The Civil War pulled regular troops east and left scattered posts with small garrisons. Telegraph lines connected major towns, but not every point on the river. Most messages still moved by horse and by interpreter. The dated steps toward crisis are clear. In late June and July 1862, the annuity shipment did not arrive. Agency officials urged patience and warned that ration distributions could not proceed without funds. Traders demanded old debts first when the money came. A hard phrase in the trader store in midsummer, "Let them eat grass," in one common wording, turned grievance into open insult. Fact versus folklore will be flagged elsewhere, but the effect in council houses was real. Elders and heads of families asked how long children should wait. Objectives diverged. For the Dakota leadership, the first aim was survival through late summer, with enough provisions and leverage to force fair deliveries. A second aim was to protect families clustered near the agencies and along the river while avoiding a fight that could not be won. Constraints were severe. Powder and lead were limited. Ammunition could not be replaced easily once used. Political cohesion across Mediwakanton, Wapakute, Sisseton, and Wapiton bands was never absolute. Food was short, and foraging near farms risked confrontation. Logistics were simple and hard at once. Mobility came from pony herds and foot trails. Scouts and runners carried news. Councils required interpreters to balance voices. Every day of delay cut options. For United States officials, the objective was order during a national war. Agency heads needed to keep distributions controlled, prevent raids on stores, and reassure settlers. Territorial leaders wanted the planting and harvest cycle to continue, and the river road to remain open. Military commanders aimed to hold Fort Ridgely, and protect towns like New Ulm while awaiting reinforcements. Their constraints were also tight. Appropriations and contracts moved on federal timetables. Garrison strength was thin. Volunteers were green. Wagons had to haul ammunition and rations over prairie roads. Telegraphs reached St. Paul, but downriver posts relied on couriers and chance meetings on the road. Immediate triggers followed one another in August. On 10 to 15 August, hunger crowds grew at the Lower Sioux Agency. Distribution stalled, while officials awaited authority. Interpreters carried sharp words back and forth. On 17 August, near Acton in Meeker County, a confrontation between young Dakota men and settlers ended in 4 deaths. News of the killings arrived at the agency the next day, with refugees already on the road to Fort Ridgely. Rumor outran proof. Families feared reprisals. In some places, settlers armed and barricaded. In others, they fled without harvest. Arrest talk, disarmament talk, and ration talk mixed in the heat. Agency officials considered holding certain men as a signal. Dakota councils considered seizing food and forcing a settlement. The governing frame was a ledger and a clock. The ledger said annuities owed. The clock said children could not wait. The last days before the first shots were not a plan, but a narrowing corridor. Each side measured risks with poor information and little time. When the corridor closed on 18 August at the Lower Sioux Agency, the buildup was complete, and the valley was set on a path that would be decided by who could move food powder and people fastest along the river. Dawn 18 August 1862 broke warm over the Minnesota River bluffs. At the Lower Sioux Agency, families of the Mdewakanton and Wapakute waited near warehouses where doors stayed shut. Couriers from Acton reached the valley ahead of formal messages, carrying the news of 4 settler deaths. Interpreters repeated fragments in council houses. Before noon, Dakota fighters pushed on agency buildings. Smoke rose in a steady column. Traders fled or hid. Andrew Myrick fell near the store. Witnesses later said grass was in his mouth. Fact and folklore mingle in that detail, but the day's outcome is clear. The agency was wrecked, ledgers scattered, and food seized for hungry households. Refugee wagons began to clog the road toward Fort Ridgely. Telegraph keys in St. Peter clicked out warnings to St. Paul, but along the river, men still rode hard with saddle notes and spoken reports. That same morning, Captain John Marsh marched from Fort Ridgely with a small detachment toward Redwood Ferry. The heat built over the open prairie, and the cottonwoods along the water hung still. Near the crossing, fire came from cover. The detachment broke. Marsh drowned attempting to recross. Word carried back by survivors cut options at the fort to defense only. Lieutenant Thomas P. Gear and Ordnance Sergeants served guns on the parade ground while boys dragged ammunition boxes. The garrison wrote messages to St. Peter and St. Paul and sent riders at dusk, knowing that reach mattered more than eloquence. On 19 August, settlers and militia concentrated in New Ulm, a town on the river with stone and frame buildings and narrow streets. Clouds boiled up in the heat of afternoon. Dakota fighters probed from the edges. Shots snapped from alleys and windows. The defenders, many with no uniform, and little drill fired from second floors and then fell back to a tighter center. Night showed flames where buildings had been. Morning brought more refugees into town and toward the river road. In New Ulm, interpreters split time between warning, pleading, and translating rumors into usable information. The effect of that day was displacement. Families with only what they could carry crowded cellars, churchyards, and wagon beds. A second and heavier attack would follow days later, but the first clash fixed New Ulm as a magnet for flight. On 20 August, the first assault on Fort Ridgely came in gusts through afternoon. The fort sat on a rise with prairie rolling away on 3 sides and the river beyond. The garrison unlimbered guns on the parade ground, firing shell over ravines and tree lines. Women and older boys carried cartridges. The guns' concussions steadied the line. Smoke drifted low. By dusk, the attackers withdrew. 2 days later, a stronger push returned on 22 August. Again, the post held. The weather turned unsettled with fitful wind and short rain. The fort's survival changed the geometry of the campaign. It kept a rally point open for Colonel Henry Sibley, then assembling volunteers upriver, and it denied a symbolic victory that might have emptied more settlements. In these days, the signal network was a patchwork. Telegraph carried alerts from St. Peter to St. Paul and on to Washington, but west of the major towns, information moved at horse speed through couriers, scouts, and messengers who knew who spoke which language. Delays compounded. A message that left at dawn might meet displaced families by noon and change to rumor by evening. Interpreters bridged Dakota English and German in the same hour, and a word translated one way could send a family to the road and another into a cellar. That friction of language and distance is part of why the first 10 days carried such weight. Primary excerpt: Henry H. Sibley Field Report, St. Peter, 24 August 1862. Fort Ridgely has repulsed 2 assaults with small loss. New Ulm has suffered severely but still holds. I move with volunteers as fast as supplies allow. Refugees are numerous. Communication beyond the fort is uncertain. I require ammunition and hard bread. Returning to the neutral narration, that report captures the frame. The post held the town bled and the road east filled. In the upper valley, the Lower Sioux Agency near present-day Granite Falls felt the pressure in late August as families gathered and small parties of fighters moved along the river bends. Sisseton and Wahpeton camps farther northwest weighed their own counsels, some seeking distance from the line of fire, others probing for captives and supplies. Bands were not a single army. Leaders balanced foodkin safety and the question of whether early success near the agencies could force deliveries and concessions without inviting a wider war. By the last week of August, Sibley advanced upriver in stages. Volunteers of the 3rd, 6th, 7th, and 9th Minnesota, many recently raised, moved with wagons over prairie roads that became ruts after rain. The nights cooled. Grasshoppers came up in sheets from the grass as columns passed. Scouts rode ahead into the flanks. When Sibley sent out a strong detachment to reconnoiter and bury dead near the Lower Agency and the ferry sites, the men found fields of ash and scattered household goods. They also found tracks that led north and west onto the higher prairie. At Birch Coulee on 2nd September, just before dawn, fighters surrounded Sibley's scouting detail, camped in low ground near a shallow draw. The weather held cool and close. Horses fell early to aimed fire. Men scraped shallow pits with plates and knives. Canteens ran low. Signals were shots and shouts. There was no line of sight to the main body. Through the day of September, the detachment lay under fire. Smoke from a prairie fire drifted at times. On the ridge miles away, Sibley heard the heavy, irregular firing, but could not fix its source until scouts returned with bearings. He marched at first light on 30 September with artillery. When the column came into view and the guns opened, the circle loosened. The relief raised the detachment shaken short of water and with most mounts dead. Birch Coulee was a tactical success for the Dakota as a field ambush and a moral blow to the volunteers. It also taught Sibley to move tighter and to cover his camps more carefully, a lesson that shaped the next weeks. Meanwhile, at New Ulm, a second attack on 23 August had already forced a deliberate contraction of the town's perimeter. Rain fell in sheets during the night before. Barricades of wagons and timbers narrowed the defended area. Civilians evacuated across the river in phases under militia cover. The effect was visible in county records for years, after abandoned farms, inventories of lost goods, and petitions for relief. In smaller settlements beyond the main road, some cabins stood with doors swinging and tables set as if a meal had been interrupted. By mid-September, the pattern was set. The Dakota held initiative in the broken ground near the river and in the wooded ravines, striking where scouts found weakness. The volunteers advanced methodically, aiming to secure captives and force a field fight on open prairie where artillery could work. Weather cooled toward autumn. Prairie fires flickered on horizons. The telegraph grew more useful as Sibley drew nearer to fixed lines and couriers risked less as the army extended its reach. The rising incidents therefore carried 3 effects. First, they displaced thousands and concentrated fear and stories in towns like New Ulm and at posts like Fort Ridgely, shaping political demand for punishment. Second, they educated both sides. The Dakota confirmed that surprise ground and ammunition husbandry could stall an army and drain its horses, while the volunteers learned to tighten camps and to let artillery speak first. Third, they created the conditions for a set-piece clash. With Birch Coulee behind them and supplies coming forward, Sibley's officers expected an attempt to seize advantage through ambush on the march. Dakota leaders expected foragers and scouts to offer a first bite. The collision would come on open prairie near Wood Lake, where the balance would pivot from dispersed strikes to a fight that decided control of the valley's road and the fate of captives waiting in scattered camps. Sibley's field force took shape in early September as volunteers concentrated at St. Peter and moved upriver in stages toward the Minnesota River bends above the Lower Sioux Agency. The order of battle was simple and green. Elements of the 3rd, 6th, 7th, and 9th Minnesota Volunteers formed the core with companies of mounted scouts and a few artillery sections under experienced ordnance sergeants. Numbers and reports vary, but a few thousand effectives with 4 to 6 guns is a cautious reading. Many men were recent recruits with little campaign time. Their opponents were Dakota fighters, drawn from Mandiwa Canton, Wapakute, Sisseton, and Wahpeton camps organized by kin and war leadership rather than by regimental tables. Ammunition on both sides was finite. The prairie itself would dictate opportunities as much as plans. The march ran in prose rather than parade. From St. Peter to Fort Ridgely to the ash fields around the Lower Agency, the column moved over roads that turned to ruts after rain and over prairie sod that swallowed wheels. Wagons hauled flour pork, hard bread, and cartridges. Streams ran in steep cutbanks that forced slow crossings and created choke points where a dozen armed men could stall a regiment. The terrain near the river alternated open grass with wooded ravines, a pattern that favored ambush and punished carelessness. Sibley advanced with deliberate camps, posting pickets deep and keeping the guns near the center. After the shock at Birch Coulee on 2–3 September, he closed intervals, tightened night security, and sent scouts ahead in wider fans. Rules of engagement and law moved with the column. Sibley announced that his immediate purpose was to protect refugees, secure captives, and defeat organized resistance, and that prisoners taken in arms would be tried by a military commission once operations stabilized. The scope was broad and the time short. Translators would mediate testimony. The promise of trials signaled to towns a coming reckoning, and to Dakota councils a closing window for negotiation. First contact after the Birch Coulee lesson did not come as a formal set piece. Skirmishes pricked at foragers and scouts as the army pushed west and couriers returned with sightings of mounted parties along the river bends. The weather cooled, nights lengthened, grass fires showed on distant horizons. In this rhythm, Sibley camped near Wood Lake on 2 September with plans to advance at daylight toward the Upper Sioux Agency. Dakota leaders decided to strike first by hitting a foraging party and drawing the main body into an ambush along the low ridges and draws near the camp. At sunrise on 23 September, foragers moved out from the camp with sacks and detail guards. Contact came suddenly. Shots snapped from cover. Men ran to ground and signaled back. The camp roused fast. Companies formed on the prairie edge while artillery sections unlimbered and sought fields of fire over the low swales. The open grass near Wood Lake allowed the guns to dominate clear lanes once targets were fixed, but Dakota fighters used the folds and brush to fire and displace. The day became a sequence of charges by small groups, counterfire from company fronts and gun sections throwing shell into likely draws. Casualty ranges are modest by later standards, but bitter for towns already emptied. Contemporary reports record dozens killed and wounded on both sides, with Minnesota companies taking losses in the first minutes, and the Dakota losing men in the counterbursts once the guns were sighted. The fight mattered not because numbers were huge, but because the column did not break, and because the ambush failed to pull the army into the kind of encirclement achieved at Birch Coulee. Volunteers learned to resist pursuit beyond supporting fire. Dakota leaders measured the cost in powder and men against the leverage gained to force deliveries or space for families to withdraw. Orders and after-action voices bracket the engagement. Henry H. Sibley Field Order near Wood Lake, 22, September 1862. The command will be prepared to march at daylight. Foraging parties will move under cover. No man will fire without orders. Samuel J. Brown. After-action note near Wood Lake, 23, September 1862. The prairie was full of smoke and voices. The guns did the work when they found the folds of ground. We held and pushed them off the near ridges. Fact versus folklore, clarification belongs here. Later retellings sometimes frame the opening of Wood Lake as an undisciplined stampede for provisions that accidentally spoiled a perfect ambush. Contemporary accounts differ on how far men strayed. The conservative reading is that a foraging detail moved under orders, made early contact, and alerted the camp, and that this combination of routine and quick reaction limited the ambush's effect. Another dispute labels Wood Lake the decisive finale of the war. A narrower phrasing is sounder. Wood Lake decisively ended the 1862 Valley Campaign, while conflict and pursuit continued west in 1863 and 1864. With the Wood Lake check, momentum shifted. Sibley pressed carefully upriver, sending flags and messages to camps where non-combatants and captives waited. On 26 September, near a place later called Camp Release, a large number of Dakota-friendly or non-combatant families and leaders who sought terms brought in captives, taken in August. Wagons received women and children, weak from weeks in movement. The humanitarian outcome was mixed. Captives were now under Army protection with food and shelter. Dakota families who surrendered were placed under guard pending decisions in St. Paul and Washington. Men identified with fighting slipped away in small groups to the plains, some to the north and west. Logistics remained a governing fact. Ammunition receipts show careful rationing. Hard bread and bacon moved forward in jolting wagons. Fresh horses were scarce, and many of the best mounts had been lost at Birch Coulee. The Army moved no faster than its slowest pair of mules and no farther than the next dependable water. In the other camps, Dakota councils counted powder horns and lead. Each volley at Wood Lake and each day on the move meant less for a stand or a winter hunt. Both sides faced the season's turn. Frost whitened grass at dawn. Fires were husbanded more closely. The legal track now opened fully. Sibley had already ordered a military commission to convene, and with captives secured and the main column stable, the docket began to fill. Interpreters worked long hours. The scope included men identified by witnesses as having killed non-combatants or committed rapes during the August raids and men taken in arms during the campaign. Proceedings were swift, often measured in minutes per case, as the commission moved through hundreds of names. The rules of evidence and definitions of combat versus murder would become the core controversy of the aftermath, but in late September, the commission's speed reflected a demand from towns and the state for visible justice. Back in the field, Sibley kept his camps tight and his routes covered, wary of a last strike against a depot or rear guard. No such blow came. Instead, the front contracted into law and administration. Companies escorted prisoners and families downriver past Fort Ridgely and toward holding sites. The road filled with wagons, mounted scouts, and refugees returning to find cabins burned and fields uncut. The immediate humanitarian picture includes care for released captives, burial details at agency ruins and farmsteads, and improvised hospitals for soldiers and civilians. Church and town committees recorded lists of the missing and the dead. From the Dakota perspective, councils in the weeks after Wood Lake faced reduced options. With an organized fight on open prairie now proven costly, and with families in hand of the Army leaders, weighed dispersion to the plains against efforts to negotiate on the river. The surrender at Camp Release closed one door and opened others toward exile and pursuit. Some men joined camps farther west and north that would encounter United States columns in 1863. Others sought distance to keep families alive through the coming winter. When the column turned its face back down the river valley, the confrontation phase had burned itself into the geography. Wood Lake stood as the field fight that fixed the line for 1862. Camp Release marked the boundary between war and custody for thousands. Fort Ridgely's earth and New Ulm's charred blocks recorded the cost of the first 10 days. The commission's docket, already fat with names, promised that the next decisions would be taken not on the prairie, but in rooms where a translator's word would weigh as much as a volley. The campaign's end state in 1862 can be stated in one line. The United States held the forts, the road, and the captives. The Dakota held only what mobility and distance could still provide. Winter and law would decide the rest. Wood Lake on 23 September 1862 and Camp Release on 26 September 1862 formed the turning point. Who is clear? Colonel Henry Sibley commanded volunteers of the 3rd, 6th, 7th, and 9th Minnesota. Dakota fighters moved under leaders from Mdewakanton, Wapikute, Sisseton, and Wapiton camps. Where is a low prairie broken by draws near Wood Lake, and a river bend above the Chippewa confluence later called Camp Release? When is 3 September days that shifted initiative and closed the valley phase of the war? Objectives at Wood Lake were blunt. Dakota leaders sought to cut the head from the column by striking its foragers and pulling the main body into an ambush near the camp. They needed a quick success that would reopen access to food and captives and force deliveries or terms. Their constraints were powder-lead and the risk that each volley spent what could not be replaced before winter. For Sibley, the objective was to hold his camp intact and advance to secure captives and end attacks on towns. His constraints were green companies, thin horseflesh, slow wagons, and a prairie where every swale could hide a line of fire. Weather was cool and dry with smoke and scattered prairie fires lowering sight lines. Rations were hard, bread and bacon. Ammunition was rationed in camp orders. Contact came with the foraging detail at daybreak. The first minutes were the most dangerous. If the main body had rushed forward into the folds of ground, the fight might have broken into pockets. Instead, company fronts formed on the prairie edge, and artillery found the draws. The immediate effect was to halt the ambush and hold the camp. Casualties were counted in dozens, not hundreds, but the strategic weight was larger. The volunteers did not break. The Dakota spent powder and lost men without seizing the wagons or guns. Initiative moved to Sibley. 3 days later at Camp Release, families aligned as friendly or non-combatant and leaders who sought terms brought captives into United States hands. This ended the leverage that came from holding women and children taken in August. Wagons took the weak from river camps to army lines. Men identified with fighting slipped away west and north. The effect of the two events in sequence was decisive for the 1862 Valley Campaign. The United States held Forts Road and captives. The Dakota held only mobility across the prairie and the chance to disperse before winter. An evidence-based counterfactual sits within narrow bounds. If the foraging detail on 23 September had been cut off without alerting the camp, and if 1 or 2 artillery sections had been caught limbered in motion, A rush might have rolled a wing of the line and forced a withdrawal toward Fort Ridgely. That would not have reversed the structural pressures recorded in summer ledgers, but it could have prolonged operations in the valley and extended the window for negotiation. Conversely, had Sibley advanced faster with looser camps, after Birch Coulee, he might have offered a cleaner ambush before Wood Lake and suffered a worse reverse. The actual outcome owes much to practiced caution after the early shock. Human cost threads through names and winter count entries. Captain John Marsh drowned at Redwood Ferry in the first days. Andrew Myrick died at the Lower Sioux Agency. At New Ulm, lists of the dead and wounded filled church books. At Birch Coulee, the tally was heavy in horses and in men dug into low ground without water. At Mankato, on 26 December 1862, 38 Dakota men were hanged after the military commission and president review. Families recorded the day as a winter count glyph of a scaffold. The road of displacement led from the lower camp below Fort Snelling through the winter of 1862 to 1863 and by steamboat to Crow Creek. There, deaths from disease and exposure marked the first season in exile. Later pursuit on the plains in 1863 and 1864 under Sibley and Sully pushed camps farther from the Minnesota River homeland. The admission against interest that sits closest to the fatal center is from the president who narrowed the list of the condemned while accepting the spectacle of an execution on that scale. Abraham Lincoln, letter to the Senate, Washington City, December 1862. I could not afford to hang men for votes. I have examined the cases and reduced the number to those proved guilty of massacres and rapes. It is a sentence that acknowledges political pressure and the limits of mercy in wartime. It also reveals the gulf between a frontier demand for punishment and the evidentiary standards that a slower court might have applied. The commission tried hundreds in weeks with interpreters summarizing testimony and with contested lines between combat and murder. The turning point at Wood Lake made such proceedings possible by stabilizing the valley and shifting decision-making from prairie to docket. Synthesis returns to the structural forces set out in the buildup. The treaties of 1851 and 1858 narrowed land and converted obligations into ledgers managed by agents and traders. Annuities arrived late or not at all. Trader credit ate into payments before food reached households. Policy split daily power between an interior agency and military garrisons, while the Civil War sent regulars east. In August, hunger and insult compressed time until councils had hours, not weeks. Under those conditions, the first 10 days decided the frame for everything that followed. Wood Lake mattered not because it was large, but because it stopped a momentum built from scarcity and rumor, and because it positioned Sibley to receive captives and to convene the commission that would define legal aftermath. Camp release mattered because it transferred human leverage from camps to columns and set families on the road to the lower camp and to Crow Creek. The turning point therefore binds battlefield ledger and council. It shows how a few days and a few miles can change the arc of a season when food is short and law is near at hand. It fixes why the Dakota War, as lived in August and September 1862, became the trials and the exile of the winter that followed. And it shows why the same forces named in summer ledgers continue into the next campaigns across the plains when the state sought to make the frontier safe for rails and river towns, and the Dakota sought to keep people alive and language intact through distance. Winter 1862 to 1863 turned the battlefield into law and administration. In late September, the military commission convened under Sibley's authority began trying Dakota prisoners at the Minnesota River camps. Proceedings ran through October and November. Interpreters summarized testimony. Witnesses from settlements and from mixed ancestry families identified men seen at killings and raids. By the end of November, the commission reported 303 death sentences. President Abraham Lincoln ordered the records to Washington and on 6 December reduced the number to 39, later corrected to 38 for execution. On 26 December 1862 at Mankato, the hangings took place under heavy guard while soldiers kept crowds back. Prisoners not executed were sent under escort to Davenport, Iowa, for confinement the following year. Civil policy followed fast. In early 1863, Congress abrogated the Dakota treaties in Minnesota, ended the annuities, and opened the Minnesota River Reservation lands for sale. The territorial government petitioned for the removal of the Dakota from the state and for militia support to prevent returns. In the river valley, a holding camp for women, children, and elders had already been established below Fort Snelling. That lower camp remained through the winter under military control, with rations issued on a schedule that was sometimes short and medical care thin. Spring ice broke on the upper Mississippi, and steamboats moved families south and west to Crow Creek on the Missouri River in present-day South Dakota. The first season at Crow Creek was hard. Bottomland soil flooded late, then dried fast under wind. Seed and tools were inadequate. Rations arrived by boat and wagon and sometimes failed. Sickness followed crowding and poor water. Mortality in the first year was high among infants and elders. Records from the Minnesota Adjutant General Office Fort Snelling Post returns Army transport manifests to Crow Creek, and congressional correspondence on the abrogation debate show the timing and scale of the transfers and the shortages that followed. Bishop Henry Whipple's letters to federal officials document appeals for better provisions and against indiscriminate punishment. The military commission proceedings and Lincoln's approval list explain who faced execution and why. Sibley's and later Sully's official reports from 1863 and 1864 show the extension of the war into the plains as columns pursued camps that had moved west from the Minnesota River. Reservation geography shifted as policy hardened. Families from the lower camp and from Crow Creek moved again to the Santee Reservation in present-day Nebraska, where soil and water proved more reliable. Others moved north to Spirit Lake and to the Sisseton-Wahpeton area on the Dakota Plains. Those who tried to remain in Minnesota faced arrest if found without express permission. Agency rules established workdays, ration schedules, and school attendance. Mission schools and later federal schools pressed English instruction and sought to suppress Dakota language and ceremony. Allotment policy would arrive later in the century, but the immediate effect of 1863 was dispossession by statute and by sheriff's sale of lands once guaranteed along the river. Land and resource use flipped quickly in the vacated valley. County plats show new town plats and farm filings along the Minnesota River within a year. Timber along the bluffs fed mills. Roads and later rail spurs connected St. Peter and the river towns to markets. Access rights that had once been described under treaty became county and state permits. While the valley filled with settlers, the exile communities managed ration economies and small fields under agency oversight. Leasing of hay meadows and grazing rights around posts and agency farms gave some income, but rarely enough to replace the lost annuities. Demography changed in two directions. In the valley, census counts rose as refugees returned to rebuild and as new migrants arrived under homestead laws. In exile communities, census counts reveal high mortality in 1863 to 1864, then slow growth as families stabilized at Santee Spirit Lake and Sisseton-Wahpeton. Births and deaths tracked the ration cycle, and disease outbreaks, typical of crowded camps and new settlements. Measles, whooping cough, and dysentery appear in post-returns and agency physician notes. The health record embedded in Fort Snelling, post-returns Crow Creek agency reports, and Davenport prison logs is uneven but consistent on one point. The first year after removal carried the greatest toll. Cultural continuance persisted under pressure. Ceremonies adapted to new river bends and new prairies. Elders kept winter counts that marked the hanging at Mankato, the lower camp below Fort Snelling, the Crow Creek removal, and the first crops at Santee. Ledger drawings preserved at museums show scouts on the prairie, the gallows, the riverboats, and the camp palisades. Language endured in households, church meetings, and eventually in classrooms organized by Dakota teachers. Traveling leaders maintained seasonal movement as policy allowed visiting relatives across the plains and maintaining kin ties that had guided councils before the war. Memory formed along two tracks. In Minnesota, towns and forts built monuments and held anniversaries that emphasized defense suffering and rescue. At Fort Ridgely and New Ulm, speeches named barricades, guns, and families lost. At Wood Lake, veterans recalled the smoke and the moment when the guns found the draws. In Dakota communities in Nebraska and the Dakotas, winter counts and church records kept names of the executed and of those who died in the lower camp and at Crow Creek. Family gatherings on cold December days remembered the men hanged at Mankato and the women and children who made the steamboat journey. Over time, commemorations in Minnesota expanded to acknowledge the camp below Fort Snelling, the executions, and the removals as part of a single story of treaty failure and war. The legal and administrative shadow stretched over the next campaigns. In 1863 and 1864, columns under Sibley and Alfred Sully moved on to the plains. Reports record the fights at Big Mound, Dead Buffalo Lake, Stony Lake, and the village near Whitestone Hill. These operations pursued men who had fought in 1862 and also struck camps of families seeking distance from the river. After-action reports and later testimonies show significant non-combatant casualties and the destruction of stores and lodges. The practical effect was to push communities farther from Minnesota and to secure stage routes and river crossings for the United States. Official reports supply dates and strengths, while family histories and winter counts supply the list of places where lodges burned and corn caches were torn open. By the late 19th century, allotment and boarding school regimes reshaped life again. Land that had been set aside in common was broken into individual allotments with surplus open to sale. Children were sent to schools that punished Dakota speech, yet the language survived and later revived. Church hymnals in Dakota helped keep vocabulary alive, even when policy sought to extinguish it. Mid-20th century activism and late 20th century legal work widened space for language classes ceremonies and repatriation. Museum catalog numbers tied to bones taken from river cemeteries now connect to return ceremonies under modern law. Present-day nations carry this history forward in law, culture, and education. Sisseton Wahpeton Oyate administers programs in language immersion health and land restoration in the Lake Traverse area. Spirit Lake Tribe sustains schools and cultural events around Devil's Lake. Santee Sioux Nation maintains community programs and language work on the Nebraska Reservation along the Missouri. In Minnesota, the Upper Sioux community, Pezihutazizi, Oyate, and the Lower Sioux community, Medewakanton, sustain governance enterprises and cultural programs in the valley once taken by statute. Prairie Island Indian community and Shakopee, Medewakanton Sioux community maintain language classes and ceremonial life while engaging in repatriation and public history partnerships. Annual runs, rides, and gatherings in December remember the men executed at Mankato and the families who endured the winter below Fort Snelling and the removal to Crow Creek. 5 to 8 records anchor this aftermath in the archives, even when details remain contested. The proceedings of the Military Commission and the Presidential Approval List show the law at work in 1862. The Minnesota Adjutant General reports and Fort Snelling Post returns trace garrison strength, prisoner transfers, and health. Army transport manifests and Crow Creek Agency reports follow the removal and the first year of scarcity and disease. Sibley's and Sully's official reports locate the 1863 and 1864 operations on the plains. Bishop Henry Whipple's letters record appeals for mercy and reform. Dakota winter counts, preserved in museum collections, hold the community timeline in images and short lines of text. Read together, these records show that the continuance of the Dakota people is not a footnote to the war, but its most enduring answer. In the long arc of United States expansion and Dakota survivance, the season of 1862 stands as a junction where treaty finance hunger and frontier fear converged into war, law, and exile. Scholarly consensus rests on 3 conclusions. First, the conflict cannot be separated from the treaty structure of 1851 and 1858 that converted land into ledgers controlled by agents and traders without reliable delivery of food and money. Second, the Military Commission's rapid proceedings and the execution at Mankato created a legal and moral precedent that still shapes debate over military jurisdiction, evidence standards, and wartime retaliation. Third, the removal from the Minnesota River and the 1863 to 1864 campaigns under Sibley and Sully transformed a valley war into a plains-wide reordering of people, routes, and power. Contested points remain and matter. Numbers of dead in dispersed killings and specific fights vary by depositions. Local ledgers and later recollections, and historians argue over which counts to privilege. Responsibility within Dakota leadership is debated, including how far Taoyataduta, known as Little Crow, could direct men drawn from distinct bands with their own councils, and how far certain raids reflected local initiative rather than a coordinated plan. On the United States side, assessments of agency conduct differ, particularly whether firmer emergency rationing in early August might have slowed the slide toward violence, and whether earlier reinforcement of Fort Ridgely and the river towns was possible, while the national war drained regular troops east. The real impact of Wood Lake itself divides readers, with some naming it decisive in ending the war, and others treating it as the local conclusion of a conflict that continued west into the plains. The enduring legacy operates in doctrine, reform, and symbol. Doctrine includes the reach of military commissions over civilians and native combatants and the executive power to revise death lists under political pressure. Reform debates that followed Bishop Whipple's appeals and later investigations helped build the case for changes in Indian affairs, even as new policies opened other avenues of loss through allotment and schooling. Symbols are carried by places and dates. Fort Ridgely, New Ulm, Wood Lake Camp released the lower camp below, Fort Snelling, Crow Creek, and Mankato form a chain of memory that links council talk to court records and a river road to distant reservations. Winter counts and ledger drawings keep the year of the gallows and the steamboat journeys alive in community time. Present-day nations teach language, conduct ceremony, care for the returned dead, and meet law with law, giving continuance a public face. This episode endures in memory because it binds a ledger to an empty shelf, A council to a volley and a river homeland to an exile whose consequences still shape families and law. From ledgers to gunfire, from Woodlake to Mankato, the story does not end. It continues in Dakota, memory and language today. How should community memory be preserved to do greater justice to the past? Leave a comment. Thank you for watching.